Hey there, welcome to this Koala Sampler tutorial episode, and as the title suggests, this is going to be part one of my deep dive into sampling. And the reason I want to split sampling up a little bit is just because there's a lot of techniques, a lot of things we can chat about, and I thought it'd be kind of cool to just start off with a nice simple basic technique. If you're a beginner, this would be really good to get you into sort of slicing samples inside of Koala in a nice kind of easy fashion and give you a few ways that you can use it. Now, it's what I would call a sort of 16 slice technique, and it works best over, say, like a 4-bar drum loop like we've got here, and I'll explain why as I go through. But first, let's take a listen to the loop itself. So I've got it on my first pad here. And of course, I just took a part of a record that I liked, this old soul record, worked out roughly what 4 bars was, and then got it looped up nicely inside of Koala. The other thing that I did, which isn't necessary, but I wanted to show you guys just for the demonstration of this video, is that I've worked out the BPM of the loop, which is 73.1. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how to do that, you can check out my last video where I showed you exactly how to calculate the BPM of a loop. But I just wanted to show you the difference between what the original BPM is and what we can do with it a little bit later. So keep that in mind, that it's a 73.1 BPM loop, 4 bars, and what we can do, we can go into tools here, go into auto chop, and generally it opens in transient view for me, but what we want to do is we want equal chops here, so we're just going to go into equal and then use our slider and get our full 16 chops. So again, for beginners, really useful because you're not having to come in and manually put any slice points in, or trying to work out timing. If you do it by transient, it's just going to put them wherever the biggest transient points are. So when you try and play something in time, it's going to be more difficult if you're not used to that kind of workflow. So this, very, very simple. All we do is we slide it up, get our 16 chops. Now, there are always exceptions to the rules. You can experiment with 8 chops, 4 chops, whatever it is, but 16 works out really well. And the reason for that is because it's going to put our slice points where our kick and our snare is all the way through this loop. Now, if we make sure we've got a choke group set, so I've got it set choke group 1, doesn't matter what group, but we do want them to choke each other out as they go along so that they've got you can only play one pad at a time essentially, and I want them in one-shot mode, so of course we can just trigger them and let them play. Then we're going to chop them to the pads. Now, because these are now sliced to every kick and snare, or pretty much on the kick and snare, I can now play this sequence through, and as long as I know a rough idea of the timing, it'll sound okay. Won't be perfect, but let me play it through. You can see how we've got that spread across. Now, as I said, my timing's not great, and the other problem that you'll generally face if you're using older samples, things that aren't quantized to a grid, is that those 16 slices won't be exactly perfect. They're in the right ballpark, but I can see just from looking at the pads where I've got these little gaps before these large transients, they're just slightly off the grid. So we can just go in and fix those very quickly. Okay, they look about right. Good enough for this example, I'm sure. So that is all sliced and generally pretty good to our kicks and our snares, pretty tight. What I would do from this point, the first technique would be to do kind of like you see in a lot of more modern boom bap stuff now, like the Alchemists, people like that do it a lot, where you're not really using anything other than the sample, and that could be to just simply create a loop or whatever it is, but you'll find sometimes they're just playing the samples, the slices, particularly like in this case where we've got drums in here. We don't really need to layer drums or do anything else on top of it. We could just play this in a new structure, a new pattern that suits us. Now, I don't have anything in mind, but I'll just muck about with them a little bit to give you an idea. Terrible, but you get the idea. You can spend some time trying to work out your slices and chops. You could record that, and maybe you want slightly longer. Maybe if you went to say 8 slices for your 4 bars, you get longer, of course, and that might work out better for that kind of technique. So you can experiment with it and play around. But you get the idea of what I'm saying. I can then just use my slices here to create a whole new sort of melody and new structure just by moving around. Now, the other thing that's really useful, if we go into sequence here, what I've done is I've brought in a drum loop into my bank B here, and I'll play you it through. But what I know about this drum loop is that it's a 2-bar loop, and it is 87 BPM. So that is now loaded up inside of here. I'm going to use 4 bars because I want it to match the original sample. And if I come out, I'll just play you a bit of the drum loop. And that's a Cooking Soul drum loop, just in case you're wondering. So yeah, that is now laid out like this. So if we wanted to fit our original loop to our new drum loop, the first thing I need to do, of course, is set the project tempo. So I know this is 87 BPM now, so I'm going to make sure that our drum loops play as a loop. So let's say our project was 87 to begin with. We brought in our drums first, then we started slicing our sample. We can do exactly the same thing. But I want to now fit this 4-bar loop to this new 87 BPM. But I don't want to use time stretch because we get all that weird noise and artifacts, and sometimes it just sounds terrible. I don't want to speed the original sample up to match because then I'm going to get the Mickey Mouse vocal thing, which I'm not that keen on either. So this is a really good technique for this. So what I'll do is I'll record it. Won't be 100% perfect because I haven't done my, fitted my exact timing on some of these slices here. It could be tidied up a little bit more. But just see what happens. I'm going to play it in exactly the same way I did before, in a sequence. And I'm just going to match that timing to 87 BPM instead of the 73 like we did before. Now I'm using quantize in this example, and aside from the fact that I would probably have to play around with my start and end points in here a little bit more, maybe tidy things up a little, you can also come in, if you find you've got timing issues, come into the grid here. This is all quantized, so it's snapping to exactly the grid. You can go into snap free like it is now and say the timing just doesn't quite line up with one of your snare drums in your drum loop. We can shift them off the grid. By the time you've played around with that, got your start and end points of your slices right, it'll sound really good. And we've essentially just made a 73 BPM loop fit to an 87 BPM drum loop instead, without time stretch, without having to do anything else. And you'll see, I'm pretty sure, people like Jay Dilla use that technique a lot. And of course, the more fun part is to take this drum loop, but then start playing around with these pads in a completely different sequence, in a different order, and just create your own, weird and wonderful sort of composition. So that is essentially the technique there, the 16 slice technique as I call it. Of course, there's lots of other ways that you can kind of go on from here and manipulate it and do other things with, but for a beginning introduction into sampling and sample chopping, that's the technique I would start with, because as I said, when you bring in your sample, you're not having to manually do any of your transients, worry too much about it. You can simply do your 16 slices, maybe play around with your pad start and end points, and you'll be able to have a lot of fun with it, getting things to kind of, just play in a new order and create something new. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. Take care, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. See you.